the town of Kilgore, 1983. It was one of the most notorious crimes ever perpetrated in East Texas. One fateful night, several individuals mysteriously vanished at a KFC restaurant, leaving authorities baffled as to what might have befallen them. To delve into today's case, let's journey back over 4 decades to 1983 in Kilgore. This city is situated in the eastern region of the American state of Texas. Its area covers approximately 19 square miles. Kilgore is renowned for its oil fields. In the 80s, it had a population of just over 11,000 people. Most residents were acquainted with one another, so they felt secure. It was largely a welcoming and hospitable community, hardly the place where one would anticipate such a heinous crime occurring. At the center of this tale is a KFC restaurant. This global chain specializes in chicken dishes. It was established by the well-known entrepreneur Harland Sanders, who began selling fried chicken during the Great Depression era. In terms of annual revenue, it's second only to the famous McDonald's company. September 23, 1983 was a Friday marking the end of the work week. Friday evening at the KFC in Kilgore was particularly hectic due to a major football game at the local high school, which drew a crowd of fans. Naturally, this meant numerous customers wanting to grab a bite or take food to go. People came and went, while employees eagerly awaited the end of an exhausting day. That evening, 3 individuals were working the closing shift at KFC: Mary Tyler, Opie Ann Hughes, and Joey Johnson. Mary Tyler, a 37-year-old assistant manager at KFC in Kilgore, was a mother of 3. After her first marriage faltered, she briefly became a single mom. She worked diligently to support herself and her children, often struggling to make ends meet. This changed when she met Billy Tyler, who became her soulmate. Her second husband also had 2 children from a previous marriage. The Tyler household grew into a large family: mom, dad, and 5 wonderful sons and daughters. Mary embraced her new role as a stepmother, loving her stepchildren as deeply as her own. The Tylers were a genuinely happy 7-member family, with no distinctions between ours and yours, where everyone valued and respected each other. Also working that evening was 39-year-old Opie Ann Hughes. She too was married with 2 children, a son and a daughter. Opie was deeply religious, viewing everything through the lens of faith. Simultaneously, she was a kind-hearted woman, a loving wife, and a caring mother. Joey Johnson, 20, was the 3rd employee on shift that night. The young man was a sophomore in college and passionate about sports, especially martial arts. He studied techniques from books and dreamed of competing one day. For now, his skills were limited to a few exercises he had learned. Unfortunately, Joey lacked a mentor to teach him proper technique. His father passed away when Joey was very young, and his mother often told him that his dad was watching his progress from heaven. Joey had long since grown up, but the habit of striving to be the best to make his father proud remained. In high school, he was class president and was accustomed to excelling to set an example for others. His strong work ethic made him well-liked at work. After a hectic evening serving customers, Mary, Opie, and Joey finally closed the restaurant doors at 10 p.m. They then began their usual closing routine, preparing everything for the next day. This included cleaning the dining area, taking out the trash, counting the day's earnings, and checking food inventory. Everything proceeded normally, with the only notable factor being fatigue after the busy Friday shift. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. At 10:45 p.m., one of Mary Tyler's daughters, 17-year-old Kimberly Tyler, arrived at the KFC restaurant to meet her mom. Kimberly also worked at the establishment, where her mother had gotten her a job, but on the first shift. She came to KFC with one purpose: to borrow some money from Mary. That evening, she had plans to see a movie with her boyfriend. Kimberly knew that after closing, employees didn't immediately go home and hope to catch her mom inside. But when she pulled the handle, the front door was locked. Kimberly peered through the window to see what her colleagues were doing, but saw no one in the dining area. When she walked around the building, she found the back door open. Entering the kitchen, she realized no one was there either. This was odd because the restaurant didn't look like it usually did at the end of a shift. Chaos reigned everywhere. Dishes, pots, pans, and saucepans were strewn across tables. Flour was scattered all over. A chef's hat had been tossed on the floor. Most alarmingly, Kimberly noticed blood, several blood spots in different places. Terrified, the girl couldn't comprehend what had happened here. Had someone quarreled and fought? Maybe an accident occurred, but where were all the employees? Where was Mom? First, Kimberly called her stepfather, Billy Tyler, and asked if Mary was home. Perhaps they had missed each other somewhere, but the man said she still hadn't returned from work. The daughter told him about the state in which she found the restaurant. Billy hurried there too, very worried about his wife. Judging by the bloodstains on the floor, Kimberly and Billy assumed that one of the employees working the last shift had an accident. They may have cut themselves or something similar. Mary's husband and daughter frantically began calling local hospitals to find out if anyone from KFC had been brought in that evening. However, no hospital had any records of this. Therefore, fearing the worst, Kimberly and Billy contacted the Kilgore police and reported the strange situation. The police arriving at the scene first determined who had been working at the restaurant that evening. The time cards for Mary Tyler, Opie Hughes, and Joey Johnson were still open, indicating they hadn't clocked out. Moreover, all three of their vehicles were parked in the restaurant's back lot, causing even greater concern. The fact that all three had vanished, leaving their cars behind, suggested a possible abduction. Detectives also examined the restaurant for potential clues, immediately noticing the scattered dishes, spilled flour, and a chef's hat lying on the floor. The disarray could indicate a struggle, but they also noticed that the restaurant's cash register was completely empty. All the money had been removed, potentially pointing to a robbery motive. This raised the question of what happened to the employees. Even before the investigation began, it was discovered that Mary, Opie, and Joey weren't actually the only people missing from the restaurant that evening. Just as the police started their work, a young woman named Lana Maxwell approached them, informing the detectives that her husband had also disappeared. Her husband was David Maxwell, age 20. David had been friends with Joey Johnson since high school. In college, they were in the same fraternity. Both guys worked at the KFC restaurant, but on different shifts. David's wife, Lana, was pregnant with their first child at the time, and her husband rarely had the chance to go out with friends. On the evening of September 23rd, just before the restaurant closed, David Maxwell left home and headed to KFC with another friend, 19-year-old Monty Landers. Monty was also a fraternity member, and the guys planned to hang out a bit. They were waiting at the restaurant for Joey to finish his shift, so the three could go have fun together. Monty Landers was a very gentle, good-natured, and simultaneously very energetic person who loved nature and dreamed of becoming a forest ranger one day. Like Joey, he enjoyed martial arts, sports cars, and rodeos. Now Lana Maxwell reported to the police that her husband, David, hadn't returned home. It turned out that 5 people were missing from the restaurant: 37-year-old Mary Tyler, 39-year-old Opie Hughes, 20-year-old Joey Johnson, David Maxwell, and 19-year-old Monty Landers. From that point, the search for the 5 missing individuals began. Texas Rangers were called in to assist, and many local residents also joined the search effort. People combed the surrounding area all night, trying to find any traces of the missing persons or anything that might indicate their whereabouts. It wasn't until the next morning that the search would yield results. But the outcome would be so unexpected and shocking that it would completely upend the quiet life of the small town. On the morning of September 24th, 1983, a member of the public stumbled upon a truly horrific scene. About 12 miles from the KFC restaurant, an oil field worker in Rusk County was about to start work at one of the fields when he noticed several people lying on the ground in a field near the road. At first, the man thought they were sleeping teenagers who had partied hard the night before, had too much to drink, and fallen asleep where their strength gave out. The worker started shouting for them to get up and go home, but no one even moved. Then, putting on a stern face, He began approaching the road to wake up the sleeping youth. When the man got very close, he realized these people weren't sleeping at all. They were actually dead. 4 people were lying near a huge pecan tree, just beyond a small bend in the path leading to the oil field site. The worker immediately contacted the police. Detectives arriving at the scene quickly determined that the deceased, 3 men and 1 woman, had been shot. They were all lying face down on the ground, side by side. They had been shot in the back of the head and in the back. Each had received at least a couple of gunshot wounds. It seemed as if they had all been lined up and executed. Of course, the police immediately understood who these victims were. They were the restaurant employees who had disappeared the day before. Some of them were still wearing their KFC uniforms. Under the pecan tree, they found the 4 bodies of Joey Johnson, David Maxwell, Monty Landers, and Mary Tyler. The dead body of Opie Hughes was found nearby, about 42 feet away from the other 4 victims. She was also lying face down on the ground and had been shot. Investigators speculated that the woman had apparently tried to escape, but a bullet stopped her. Additionally, a theory emerged that it was unlikely one person had acted alone here. Firstly, it would have been difficult for a single criminal to overpower 3, albeit unarmed, but nevertheless athletic young men. Secondly, it was established that the bullets that took the lives of all the victims were fired from at least 2 different .38 caliber pistols. After discovering the bodies, detectives searched for clues, starting right at the restaurant where the 5 employees had been abducted. The Kilgore police made a huge mistake at the very beginning of this case by not properly securing the crime scene. The restaurant stood open for an entire day, and most of the evidence was possibly destroyed. Eventually, experts did check the premises for fingerprints. They also took a cardboard box that held the cash register tape because they found blood spatter on it, as well as a paper napkin with some brownish stains. It's worth remembering that this was 1983, when DNA analysis and forensic expertise were in their infancy. They barely existed yet. So although the authorities had blood samples, they couldn't do anything with them at the time. This in no way brought them closer to identifying the perpetrators. However, the detectives found something else. It was a human fingernail stuck behind Joey Johnson's jeans belt, and this torn-off fingernail didn't belong to him. His hands, if one could put it that way, were intact. The police decided that perhaps this fingernail belonged to one of the criminals and that it had torn off during the struggle. The autopsy showed that Johnson had received the most gunshot wounds compared to the other victims. This led detectives to think that the young man was the only one who had resisted. Maybe he tried to take the gun from one of the attackers, and during this struggle, the shooter's fingernail caught on his jeans and got stuck behind the belt. Investigators hoped that later they would be able to compare this fingernail with the fingernails on the hands of future suspects. Shortly after, the police had their first suspect in this case. It was a man named James Earl Mankins, Jr. Interestingly, James Mankins Sr., his father, was a former state representative. Although these two were the closest relatives, they were complete opposites. Mankins Sr. was a respected person who once held a high position. Mankins Jr. often came to the attention of law enforcement. He was already known at the police station, as James constantly had problems with the law, mainly due to crimes related to controlled substances. He was involved in selling prohibited drugs and could be quite violent. As soon as articles about the crimes at the KFC restaurant appeared in the media, this man began going around threatening everyone to be wary of him. Otherwise, they would end up like those 5 from Kentucky. He seemed to be boasting that the bloody incident was his doing. Such statements by Mankins Jr. led to him being called to the police station to give testimony. This was on October 1st, 1983, about a week and a half after the crime. Detectives asked James if he had any involvement in the KFC restaurant incident, to which he naturally responded negatively. However, during the interrogation, investigators noticed that the tip of the middle finger's nail on Mankins' right hand was missing. This immediately served as a red flag. When asked what happened to his nail, James replied that he had just caught it on something somewhere. With Mankins' consent, The police photographed his finger and made several casts to later compare with the torn-off nail found on Joey. While experts in the laboratory tried to conduct a comparative analysis of the nail, detectives looked into the suspect's movements on the day of the crime to establish if he had an alibi. It turned out that on that very day, James Mankins Jr. had been released from prison for illegal possession of a firearm. His gun and rifle were confiscated, but immediately after his release, the man borrowed a pistol from an acquaintance. It was a .38 caliber revolver, matching the one used to shoot the 5 victims. The day after the incident, James returned the weapon to his friend. All of this, of course, looked very suspicious. The borrowed pistol was seized and sent for ballistic testing. Unfortunately, experts could not accurately determine if this was definitely the weapon used in the killing of the 5 restaurant employees. In any case, they now had another piece of evidence pointing to James Mankins as the alleged perpetrator. Kilgore residents, knowing what Mankins Jr. was like, immediately put forward the theory that this whole incident with 5 deaths was somehow related to controlled substances. Perhaps the restaurant was secretly dealing in prohibited goods. There were also rumors that a secret recipe for a hallucinogenic drug was hidden in the depths of KFC, and James wanted to find it out. In general, while there were no concrete facts, the public easily put forward their own assumptions, even if fantastic. The controlled substances theory wasn't the only one in this case. A second theory was that of a robbery gone wrong. It was known that all the day's earnings were stolen from the cash register. However, it's unlikely that this amount could have been worth 5 employees' lives. Most likely, the perpetrator broke into the restaurant after closing with the intention of robbing the establishment. The workers panicked. Perhaps one of them recognized the criminal, which sealed the fate of both themselves and their colleagues. There was a witness who claimed to have heard one of the employees talking on the phone earlier on the evening of September 23rd, shortly before the terrible events occurred. She mentioned that there was about $2,000 in the cash register that needed to be taken to the bank. Presumably, this was Kimberly Tyler, and she was talking to her mother, Mary, who later came to the restaurant for the second shift. Mary Tyler was the assistant manager, and part of her duties included taking the earnings to the bank. The girl was having a work-related conversation while standing right at the food counter. The witness told the police that at that very moment, 2 men were standing near the counter. These 2 might have subsequently had some connection to the night's incident. To the witness's great regret, he didn't personally know these customers. However, thanks to the description he provided, 2 new potential suspects emerged in the case. Based on the description, the police were able to identify these men. In fact, they were already on the list of individuals the police intended to interview as part of the investigation. They were cousins, 44-year-old Darnell Hartsfield and 47-year-old Romeo Pinkerton. Both attracted the attention of investigators because they matched the description of the men who had overheard Kimberly's phone call about the amount of cash in the restaurant's register, and were also known to the police for previous offenses. At that moment, Darnell was wanted. An arrest warrant had been issued for him because just a couple of days after the KFC killings, Darnell and a friend committed an armed robbery of a grocery store in Tyler, Texas, located just 25 miles from Kilgore. And this crime very much resembled what happened at KFC, except that all the employees remained in good health. Darnell and his accomplice attacked the store right at closing time. They deliberately chose a time when it was already getting dark outside and there were no people around. They also took all the cash from the register, threatening the grocery store employee with a .38 caliber pistol. This was the same type of weapon used by the criminals when they shot Mary, Opie, Joey, David, and Monty. Therefore, the police very much wanted to talk to the 2 cousins, Darnell and Romeo. Romeo Pinkerton was found first. He was brought to the police station and asked where he was on the night of the KFC restaurant attack. Romeo replied that he was in jail on charges for another crime. He was released only a few days after the incident at the restaurant, so he had no involvement in this case. When Darnell Hartsfield was arrested, he also denied any involvement in the attack on KFC employees. The police made him take a polygraph test, which he successfully passed. For the detective at the time, This seemed sufficient to rule him out as a suspect. Nowadays, people know that lie detectors can be deceived, and data obtained during such tests cannot be used in court as evidence. But in 1983, the polygraph was considered a fairly accurate device, so both brothers were released and excluded from the list of suspects in this case. There was no concrete evidence against them. Both brothers soon ended up in jail again for other crimes, while the police continued to question persons of interest in the investigation. From the very beginning, the KFC restaurant killings in Kilgore were reported in all the news, and detectives received numerous tips about various individuals. Unfortunately, most of these leads turned out to be dead ends. The detectives working on the case still suspected James Mankins Jr., but they also had no solid evidence against him. The fact was that the comparative analysis of the torn-off fingernail found on Joey Johnson's body and the cast from the suspect's hand did not provide a definitive answer. Some experts found a complete match between the samples presented, while others believed that the nail belonged to a completely different person, not Mankins. So the authorities could not charge him or hold him accountable. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. For many years, the investigation into the attack on restaurant employees in Kilgore remained unsolved. It went completely quiet, and the 5 victims who died that night received no justice. This was very difficult for their families. 3 young men in their prime left parents to live out their days with a heavy wound in their hearts. One of the young men was supposed to become a father, but his child would never know his real dad. The husbands of Mary and Opie were left as single fathers, forced to shoulder all the responsibilities of raising children. The relatives of the 5 deceased did not want to give up and allow the killers to roam free. All these years, they constantly tried to get the case reopened. And so, after 10 years, in September 1993, the case was transferred to the Texas Attorney General. Everyone hoped that now, with the latest advances in DNA and forensics, the police would finally be able to solve this case. The torn-off fingernail and the cast of James Mankins Jr.'s hand were sent for testing to a laboratory in Dallas. Once again, results came back reporting that DNA was absent from both samples. This wasn't a 100% match, but detectives believed they could now charge Mankins for the KFC killings. Again, things didn't go as planned. Before the trial began, the prosecution team decided to bolster the evidence with another expert examination to convince the jury of Mankins' guilt. They sent the evidence to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which was considered the most advanced forensic laboratory at the time, capable of conducting more complex and reliable DNA tests. And how disappointed they were when, after conducting the tests, the DNA analyst found that James' nail did not match the torn-off nail fragment at all. This information completely undermined the case against Mankins because it was the only convincing evidence linking him to the crime. All charges were dropped before the trial even began. James Mankins Jr. himself was as happy as a child, because if it weren't for the repeated examination, he could have already been on death row for crimes he didn't commit. However, Kilgore residents still sincerely believed that Mankins was responsible for the deaths of 5 people. They thought his high-ranking father had intervened and hushed up the case against his own son. Mankins Sr. had enough connections for this, but all of this was just ridiculous rumors, and the police were back to where they started. They had to look for potential suspects again. If they couldn't figure out who the criminal was when the trail was still hot, what could be done 10 years later? Naturally, the detectives didn't learn anything new. The hopes of the victims' families for belated justice remained unfulfilled once again. The Kilgore Massacre case was only reopened in 2001, almost 18 years after the tragedy. By that time, even more developments and advances in forensic science had emerged. The team of detectives assigned to this case as part of the new investigation took all the old evidence related to this case from storage and sent it for testing. This included the cardboard box with the restaurant's receipt tapes that had blood spatter on it, a paper napkin with brownish stains, the infamous fingernail found behind the belt of one of the victims' jeans, and the clothing of the deceased. Finally, there was a breakthrough in the case. Modern DNA testing of samples taken from dried blood drops found a complete match with two criminals whose DNA samples were stored in the CODIS database. The blood on the box and napkin belonged to two cousins, Darnell Hartsfield and Romeo Pinkerton. These two men were considered suspects at the very beginning of the investigation, but were ruled out because Darnell successfully passed a polygraph test, and Romeo was supposedly in jail when the restaurant attack occurred. But in reality, this was a lie. Romeo had lied, as he had been released a few days before that tragic night. The reason the police allowed this deception at the time was due to Hurricane Alicia. Hurricane Alicia was a small but powerful tropical cyclone that caused significant destruction in the greater Houston area of southeast Texas in August 1983. It caused $3 billion in damage. Thousands of homes were destroyed, city streets were strewn with debris. Massive power outages and flooding affected much of southeast Texas. In addition to strong winds, storm surge, and heavy rain, Alicia spawned 22 tornadoes. Because of all this chaos that happened a couple of weeks before the tragedy at the restaurant in Kilgore, it was difficult for the police to verify prison records and confirm that Romeo had actually been released from jail several days earlier. It turned out that the criminals had been right under the police's noses all these years, but that's not all that the new investigators managed to find out. When retrieving the clothes that the victims were wearing on the day of their deaths, one of the detectives noticed a color change on Opie Hughes' underwear that had not been noticed earlier in 1983. The stains turned out to be traces of seminal fluid but not belonging to Opie Hughes' husband. It was revealed that before the woman was shot, she had been subjected to forced sexual intercourse. This now explained why her body was found several meters away from all the other victims. She wasn't trying to escape. She had been forcibly dragged away and assaulted. Even more strangely, the biological material found on the woman's underwear did not match either Darnell Hartsfield or Romeo Pinkerton, so there must have been a third criminal. As a precaution, the DNA profile was compared to James Mankin's DNA profile, and this person turned out to actually not be involved in the killings. A search in the CODIS database also revealed no matches. The team of detectives checked the DNA of about 180 men who they thought could potentially be involved in the crime, but also found nothing. Despite the absence of a third suspect, the police began to act. The families of the deceased victims had already lived so many years waiting for justice that it simply made no sense to delay further. In November 2005, cousins Darnell Hartsfield and Romeo Pinkerton were arrested. They were charged with the murders of Mary Tyler, Opie Hughes, David Maxwell, Joey Johnson, and Monty Landers. In fact, Darnell had already been in Texas prison since 1995, having received a 40-year sentence for delivering controlled substances and participating in organized criminal activity, but then was released on parole. Now let's return to that fingernail on which the detectives handling this case initially placed great hopes in catching the criminal. They sincerely believed that the torn-off part of the nail plate found on Joey Johnson's belt belonged to one of the attackers. But it turned out that it was the nail of one of the victims, Mary Tyler. Apparently, the woman somehow caught her hand on her colleague's clothes and tore off part of her nail. Now that the case had gone to trial, Romeo Pinkerton made a deal with prosecutors and agreed to plead guilty to lesser charges, so he no longer faced the death penalty. Instead, he received 5 life sentences simultaneously and was sent to prison in Texas. Despite pleading guilty, he still denies his involvement in the killings of the restaurant employees. Even if Pinkerton hadn't made a deal with the prosecution, his execution would likely have been in question. Defense lawyers asserted that he had a history of intellectual disability, which, according to a U.S. Supreme Court ruling, prohibited him from receiving a lethal injection. Romeo stated that he only pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, but he didn't take anyone's life. He even claimed that the police framed him because of his skin color, planting a paper napkin stained with his blood at the crime scene. However, he didn't consider that the evidence was found in the KFC restaurant back in 1983, when DNA identification technology was practically non-existent. The police at that time knew little about methods of comparing DNA profiles. It's unlikely they could have guessed that years later, this napkin, allegedly somehow planted among the evidence, would play a crucial role in the accusation and incriminate Romeo. Darnell Hartsfield, unlike his cousin, did not plead guilty and went to trial in 2008. The prosecution team presented to the jury a theoretical version of the events that occurred on September 23, 1983, at the KFC restaurant in Kilgore. Presumably, Darnell, Romeo, and possibly a third man were in the restaurant when one of the employees mentioned in a phone call to the assistant manager about $2,000 in the cash register that needed to be taken to the bank. As soon as they heard the amount of cash, they decided to commit a robbery when the restaurant closed for the night. So later that evening, Darnell, Romeo, and the third criminal returned to KFC when the last customer had left. The staff was cleaning the kitchen and tidying up the dining area. The perpetrators encountered Joey Johnson in the back of the restaurant as he was about to take out the trash. The trio, pointing a gun at the student, forced him back inside, after which they threatened the other workers there, Mary, Opie, as well as David and Monty, who were sitting in the dining area waiting for Joey to finish his shift. The brothers took the money from the cash register. Clearly, some struggle occurred in the kitchen because pots, cutlery, and pans were scattered, and there was blood on the floor. The reason why these three men decided to kidnap 5 people and take them to another location rather than leave with the money remained unknown. Perhaps they panicked that they would be reported to the police, and they simply decided they couldn't risk their freedom by leaving witnesses alive. The criminals drove all 5 employees to that oil field 12 miles from the restaurant, lined them up, and executed them. Opie Hughes suffered more than the others because the third unidentified accomplice decided to assault her before shooting her. Monty Landers didn't work at the restaurant. He wanted to hang out with friends, but the hangout ended in a way none of them expected. When Darnell Hartsfield's trial came to an end, the jury found him guilty on all 5 counts of capital murder. Like Romeo, he was given 5 consecutive life sentences. In February 2010, Darnell filed an appeal, but his sentence was upheld. However, he spent only about 14 years in prison before passing away in May 2022. His death at the age of 61 occurred naturally, unlike the 5 people whose lives he stole. Darnell died in his prison cell after a massive stroke. At the time, his next parole hearing was scheduled for January 2023, but he didn't live to see it. His cousin and accomplice, Romeo Pinkerton, remains incarcerated to this day, still contesting his involvement in the KFC employee killings. As for the third criminal, he still hasn't been found. This person apparently has never been held accountable, and his DNA hasn't entered the police database. Opie Hughes' family literally begged Romeo and Darnell to name the third attacker, but the brothers never did. The most terrible thing about this story is that 5 innocent souls perished, and the inhuman beings who took their lives more than 20 years ago enjoyed life and freedom. More than 40 years later, the Kilgore mass murder case is only half solved. Investigators are still trying to find the third criminal, to find a match with his DNA profile, but to date, he still hasn't been apprehended. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.